Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us for another Kingsbridge webinar. Today's webinar is actually very unique in the fact that it's the first one that we've done in our series that has actually come about after the IR35 private sector reform. So it's obviously the private sector reform happened on April the 6th. So today's webinar is going to be really focused around those conversations that those end clients and those recruiters might be having with each other, and also how the recruiters in that chain might be able to benefit themselves now and going forward with keeping and remaining compliant and ensuring that contractors work compliantly in respect of IR35. Just whilst we wait for a few more people to join the session, we'll run through a few bits of housekeeping first of all. So first of all, this session is expected to last no longer than 1 hour. So hopefully we'll conclude everything inside of that 1 hour slot. There will also be a recording of this session available afterwards. So that will be sent out via email. So if you do join late, or if you have to dip off this call at any point, you will be able to rewatch the session later on via the recording that's going to be sent out. Any questions that you may have, do please feel free to enter them in the question section or in the comment section, and we'll try and get through as many of those after the session via email as possible. So we'll try to get as many of those answered for you as we can. I am delighted to be welcomed on today's session by two guests. One usual face that you might see on these calls is Andy Robinson. I'll let Andy introduce himself in a moment, but I'm also delighted to be joined by Tania Bowers from APSCo as well. So we'll let them both introduce themselves in just one moment. As we say, any questions that you may have, do please feel free to put them into the comments and questions box, and we'll try to get back to as many of those as we can. But I think we'll start with you, Tania. Would you please give us an introduction to who you are and also APSCo as well?
Okay, so firstly about me, my name's Tania Bowers. I'm the General Counsel and Head of Public Policy at APSCo. I'm a solicitor and I've been working in the recruitment market, whether in-house in Senior Head of Legal Director role, or at APSCo for over 20 years now. So I saw IR35 when it came in first in 1999, and it's still very much central to what I do now. APSCo stands for the Association of Professional Staffing Companies. It was formed because of IR35 and the need to represent the professional staffing industry. It now has approximately 1,000 members across various STEM and other professional sectors. And APSCo also has offices in Germany, Singapore, and Australia.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tania. So definitely well represented on this call. I'm certainly looking forward to picking your brains a bit more on kind of how APSCo's seen this reform, both now in the public sector and I guess IR35 historically as well. Andy Robinson, let's move over to you. Do you want to introduce yourself and kind of what you do here at Kingsbridge?
Of course, yeah. So I'm Andy Robinson. I'm the Business Development Director at Kingsbridge. I've worked with Kingsbridge for about 8 years now. So I mean, I wasn't around or involved in the inception of IR35, but I've seen the public sector roll out and the two attempts at the private sector reform. So yeah, we've historically Kingsbridge have worked in the contractor insurance space and insured recruitment businesses and accountancies and umbrella businesses. But more recently, clearly, we've worked with recruitment parties and clients and helping the determinations of contractors, and then helping the insurance world behind the IR35 decisions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andy. So I think a real kind of great place to start here then is right at the beginning, I guess. And Tania, you first of all. APSCo was obviously formed to make sure that those agencies, those recruiters, have a voice when it comes to IR35 and kind of all things going on in the staffing industry. How have you found IR35 to really affect the members of APSCo? Not just now, but kind of historically over time. Is it something that you've seen agencies kind of slowly become more accustomed to, or is the kind of two most recent reforms in the public sector and now obviously the private sector, is that what's kind of jolted the industry to move much more, I guess, hastily now than perhaps the interest that they might have had previously?
I think initially working through a personal service company was fairly limited to IT contractors back in the day, shall we say. And this actually came slightly about because of the rules that govern employment businesses, and the desire to work with freelance independent contractors, working through their own sort of businesses. Now, over the years, this has obviously hugely expanded into many other sectors, some of which were more suited to personal service company contractors than others. And we have had lots of challenges in between 1999 and 2017, to be honest. Hmrc continued to bring in new and different regulations, such as the managed service company regulations in 2007, and changing the rules around expenses that you could claim if you worked through an umbrella company in 2016. But effectively, the industry had got used to the fact that it was the contractors and their limited companies' responsibility to decide their off-payroll status for a placement, and that it was not something that the supply chain, namely the recruitment business or clients, had to worry about too much. Now, obviously, Hmrc have been talking about reforming off-payroll because IR35 was never what they intended. They have had incredible difficulty claiming money back from individual contractors if Hmrc decided they'd used the wrong status for an assignment. So they very much were looking for an easier way, frankly, to enforce the law. And hence we finally got to in 2015 when they started talking very seriously about changing the rules in a way that effectively is the way that they've been introduced in the public sector and now. So when we look at the public sector in 2017, we'd sort of got to a position where there were groups of workers that really shouldn't have been working through personal service companies. And I think, for example, nurses are a good example of that. So it really did shake up the marketplace and had a number of unintended consequences, such as people working through non-compliant umbrella companies. And, you know, we still see these problems now, and post the 2021 go live, there's still a lot of issues to resolve. And I think there is still just a general belief that actually off payroll remains quite bad law. So I don't think the story's over yet, to be honest.
Andy Robinson now, obviously with talking about the changes in the public sector having, you know, somewhat of a big change for the entire supply chain. What did Kingsbridge really see? You know, what did we see in terms of those changes, both from a contractor perspective and also with the partners that we work with? How did those changes impact the businesses that we work with?
Well, the first ripple effect was there were populations of limited company contractors that were told you can no longer work through your PSC, told to work through different payment vehicles. So from a contractor insurance perspective, they no longer needed that limited company insurances. So we lost policyholders. And I'm thinking there were definitely certain job roles that probably should never have been working through a limited company, and they moved elsewhere, and we've never seen that cohort come back to Kingsbridge. I think there was it was the first like trial run in that area where the client and the recruiter were involved in status determinations. And I mean, if you read Hmrc's interpretation of how it went, it probably differs to my view and probably quite a few recruitment businesses' view, that there were contractors that walked off site having been told you can't work through a limited company. There were clients that just didn't really know what to do. I think the challenge with all of this, and the challenge even this time round, is it's very technical. It's very like niche tax legislation, and there aren't a great deal of businesses out there that really get it and understand. So without going to third-party help and left to your own devices, it's a very difficult situation to be in. So I think my feedback from that public sector reform was there was a lot of disruption. But having said that, and some of the stats that you see now, there are more contractors and more limited company contractors working in the public sector than ever before. So it's like every piece of legislation that comes in, and we plot a graph in quite a few of our presentations that shows all the different pieces of the legislation that have come in the contractor workforce that affects these population of workers. And whether that's MSC, whether that's IR35, other types of legislation, through all of this disruption, the number of limited company contractors, the number of freelancers, the number of contractors in general is increasing. And again, without coming on to what we've seen this time round, I think likelihood is we'll see a very similar effect in the private sector.
Yeah, and I think that's probably been pretty consistent since the year 2000. You know, the trend of limited company contractors, I think, has only increased, despite all of the challenges that, you know, these contractors are actually facing. Tania, I'd like to ask you a question here, actually, on something that Andy's mentioned there. So we all know that Hmrc's rhetoric with both the public sector and indeed, you know, in probably 12 months' time, their rhetoric is going to be that this has been a blinding success. Aside from the revenue that they are going to gain from this, do you see this as being successfully implemented already in the public sector? And do you think that, you know, how should we view this in terms of, you know, what should we look at when we're saying it's a failure or a success? You know, where should we put that gauge? Is it on how businesses work together? Is it on contractors that are working compliantly? Is it number of contractors? You know, what do you think that might look like?
Well, I think, as you say, Hmrc tend to have a very positive view of their own success on this piece of legislation. They did recently issue more feedback on the public sector reforms. It was a fairly small cohort and it excluded NHS. So I think we have to sort of bear that in mind. I think, broadly speaking, it was reasonably accurate in it said, well, yes, people have adapted to the changes and there are still contractors, which, you know, mirror what's been said already. So, but on the other hand, this, you know, it's a very difficult law. Effectively, lots of people, thousands of people, are being put into a situation, if they work inside IR35 through their limited companies, where they're effectively zero rights employees. They're taxed as employees, but they don't get any worker rights. Theoretically, they get them through the company, but that's you know, that has to be taken out of taxed income. So I think there are quite a lot of problems, and we have to look at this holistically as the supply chain as a whole. Is this going to have a positive aspect on the supply chain? Well, no, absolutely not so far, because it's created a lot of pressures and uncertainties in the supply chain around getting the SDS, the status determination, right in itself, and then looking at what the alternatives are, such as umbrella companies. So no, I don't think it's had a positive impact. Will it result in more tax collection for Hmrc? Well, quite possibly, but, you know, effectively, in most cases, we're talking about employers' NIC. So again, it might not be as huge a tax take as they're anticipating. And I don't think it will be the end to things like IR35 legislation. Fundamentally, the law on employment status and status for tax and status for rights has got to be reformed, and actually there shouldn't be two statuses. And if that happened, then it would effectively make off-payroll obsolete.
And I guess coming on to kind of those challenges and problems that the supply chain's facing now, obviously the reforms happened. You know, we're somewhat a kind of month into it now. How have you seen APSCo members react? What's been the kind of common things that you're seeing APSCo members actually struggle with, and what are some of the kind of more common areas of concern from those members?
I think really all of our members, from our smallest members to our largest global enterprise members and outsource members, have struggled with those clients that really didn't pay attention to this until the 11th hour and then expected things to happen very fast. Some clients have just refused to do the status determination, and that's created a friction. The SDS isn't legally due until they make the first payment, which might, and that time might not have passed yet, but it's what do you do if your client refuses point blank to issue an SDS, for example, because they say they're wholly overseas or it's a consultancy. So it's a matter of, pointing out to them that they carry the liability for this legislation. Some confusion around small company and whether they're a small company, which we'd seen consistently over the months to implementation that this was an issue. And then I suppose in that last month or so, they did receive quite a lot of client addendums around implementing this law, some of which were really just stating the law itself. Others were requiring really quite dramatic indemnities from the sort of lower tiers supplier recruiters, and also an obligation, them carrying the legal obligation basically for whether the status remained valid during the assignment. Now, in reality, if that it's a complex chain, then neither the MSP nor the second tier recruiter actually controls what is happening on site. So really, it has to be a collective attempt to ensure that the status does remain accurate, and if things do change, then actually there's a very clear process for signposting that to make sure that there's a new SDS. So I think there's some of the key issues our members have been facing.
Tania, just jumping in on that indemnity point, how enforceable are these indemnity clauses?
Well, commercial parties are able to agree and negotiate terms between themselves. However, a contract, if it got to court, there always would be an assessment of whether there was a fair negotiating position, whether there was equal bargaining power. Yeah. However, I would never really recommend that people sort of rely on that final day. And it's things like, well, were the terms signed? Well, under English law, they don't have to be signed to be effective, to be honest. And if there's a course of dealing. So it's a very tricky position because these were often mid-contract. So there was quite a lot of pressure to get them signed to sort of move on. Yeah. Particularly with their larger MSP providers and clients. Yeah,
and certainly if there are a number of recruitment businesses in that supply chain and some are willing to sign it, that adds further pressure on those that are really debating not signing it.
Yeah, that push back and try and negotiate, exactly. And obviously different clients have very different approaches to negotiating.
There's a few points that come off the back of that. There's a lot of clients that are seeing alternatives to kind of managing this reform. So you spoke about looking at the parties in the chain trying to indemnify each other and so on. But I've always been a big advocate of tackling IR35 head on, dealing with it in the most compliant manner. If you've got a good process in place, then really you should try and do as much as you can to eliminate there being a risk later on down the line. You don't have those arguments if you've got a good compliant process in place right from the offset. Is that something, Tania, that you've seen APSCo members really adapt and take on? And how common is it within the more so the members, role to kind of take on a process of looking at status and maybe presenting that process to their clients?
I think it varies. It varies depending on member and the member size, and it varies very much on the client and how the client wants to approach it, and how sophisticated the client is, and how much the client's controlled by procurement, and there has to be a one-size-fits-all solution to everything. As we know, a lot of clients in some sectors took a risk-averse approach, which has been in place now for over a year, I suppose, whereby they just said, we will only work with contractors that are on a payroll, whether that's your payroll or umbrellas. So obviously members have had to adapt to that. And that's probably going to relax over time, I suspect, particularly if they find they can't find the talent they need, because as we all know, the contractor market, there has been a COVID rebound. We've really seen that in our March recruitment sector numbers here at APSCo. It's been a big rebound, which is great. And so they might start to find that pressure. So I think a lot of recruiters have very actively tried to steer their client in the right direction. A lot of clients wanted to start off with using the CES tool, and many have kept going with that. Others have, if it comes out uncertain, they're looking to their recruiters for a solution, and that's where another assessment, perhaps backed by insurance such as Kingsbridge, has come in and has been useful to the industry for managing these supply chain risks. So I think it's a mixed bag. But what I would like to say actually was I think our APSCo members were really quite prepared for this. And I think it really did show the benefit of being a member of an organisation like APSCo, because we've been having events, like this, and we've been doing guidance and model contracts and training, for years on this. So I do actually think that our members were genuinely very well informed, which was positive.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. Certainly what I'm seeing when I'm talking with agencies or indeed clients is, those businesses that are affiliated to organisations, like APSCo and partner with businesses such as APSCo and Kingsbridge are, so much better prepared than those who aren't, because they feel like we're sharing the burden with them, and that's what we're here to do. We're here to share that burden and guide the supply chain in the right direction. Andy Robinson, I wanted to come to you on one of the points in there, which is looking at really how businesses and organisations like APSCo and Kingsbridge can help those businesses deal with status, perhaps deal with those issues around status, and help and guide those conversations that they're having with clients and with contractors. What are the sorts of things that Kingsbridge are doing and seeing, and also just to touch on those kind of PSC bands? We're already having quite positive conversations with clients. I think of one that I was on just I think yesterday, where there's one particular client, they implemented a PSC ban. They're now ears open to kind of looking to reverse that at some point in the future. And as Tania said, do you think that that'll be a common thing that we see now that businesses become, I guess, more comfortable with the risk, they start to manage it better? Do you think those bans will soon be turned?
Yeah, well, there's a few points in there. I think so the question around preparation, and I totally agree with Tania and yourself that there were a lot of recruiters that really tried to get to grips with the legislation, and actually saw that with all of this uncertainty and noise, sometimes that brings quite a good opportunity. And you going out as a recruitment business and talking to clients and holding their hands through this time, clearly that does a number of things. It it builds you a closer relationship with your client, which will bring further opportunity to you as a recruitment business. It also helps with your getting the process right, as we've said, also then helps to mitigate the risk. If you and your client and contractor are all working towards the same goal and all aligned with your thinking, it's certainly going to make you feel a lot more comfortable as the fee payer sat in the chain. So I think we've seen a lot of the recruitment businesses that are using the Kingsbridge tool actually turn this round and into a good thing, that now they have stronger relationships than ever with their client, that they now become that either sole provider or they get that first grab at any vacancies. So yeah, and I mean, the big thing there is we've got through this really, really busy time, but the legislation hasn't gone away. And we're now moving into this sort of like business as usual world where next placement, what's that role look like? Is that going to be inside or outside IR35? Am I advertising that as an inside-outside role? What does that do to the quality of candidate that I can find? And these types of conversations that are ongoing. So, I mean, it feels like at Kingsbridge we've had a chance to catch our breath, and things have definitely quieted down. But now it's onto that next job of that business as usual process. It's the clients that are blanket banning and their mindset now of what are they thinking is the next steps. Those, as Tania said, that are using CES, that actually a percentage come back as we don't know the status, like they still need help. Those that are using other providers out there, maybe that aren't that cost effective and long term isn't a strategy you can go down. There's still a ton of opportunity for the recruitment market to get out there and provide solutions to different clients. To the point around those blanket determinations or those really risk averse assessments, I think there is no doubt that will change over time. We did a contractor survey where I think we had roughly 3,000 respondents from contractors, and we asked questions such as, would you accept an inside decision, or like what would it take for you to accept an inside decision? And the overwhelming response was, we would be very reluctant to take an inside role, and I wouldn't want to work through an umbrella company, or I wouldn't want to go agency PAYE. Or if I were to go down that route, it's probably going to cost the client a lot more money than it would through a limited company position. So it's all of these conversations and changes that we are seeing now in April, as Tania said, the status determinations are still ongoing because people haven't been paid yet. That these first paychecks, that's that really emotive time of, I used to be paid this and now that has changed to Y. That again will start conversations with clients. That will start people thinking about, okay, what is happening in the market, and where are these outside roles? Who are those businesses that are assessing status and allowing people to work through a limited company? So I think my big point here is just there's still a lot to get through, and we can all just, like, we've got through April the 6th and the world hasn't ended as some people have predicted. So it's now what's the next job for everyone?
Yeah, I think the world hasn't ended just yet. I'm not sure if COVID might have something to say about that at some point in the future. Hopefully not. But Tania, coming on to more or less some of the best practices that these recruitment businesses will ultimately implement, both now and in the future. As we've said, this is not something that is just simply happening once on April 6th and then it's an annual event. This is going to be something that businesses are going to need to look at almost every single day, as long as they're placing contractors, to use a very extreme example. But what best practices would you recommend the majority of both recruiters to implement, and also end clients, to kind of look for in those end clients? So if a recruiter's spotting trends of things happening, I'll give you a pretty straightforward example. We had a partner of ours ask us yesterday that they have an end client who has not produced an SDS. Do they therefore go searching for it? Do they wait? Because ultimately it might not be in their interest to actually go and get it.
Yes, that's an interesting one. I think, like any compliance step with a client, or most compliance steps with clients, ultimately there should, what can you do apart from implement a chase procedure, but then actually say, well, actually, this is your liability. We're trying to help you here. If you don't do an SDS, then you absolutely haven't taken reasonable care. It's unarguable. Well, in actual fact, the deemed liability, the liability for the tax never left you. So it is your liability. So I think all you can do is put that in writing to the client, and proceed. I think actually the industry is being incredibly responsible, by doing so much actually to push for these SDSs, because of course the liability does sit with the client, and until such time as they issue an SDS to the next party in the chain and to the worker. So I think that is a challenge, that we're seeing. We're not going to have to face that problem again of converting workers that were working outside IR35, to a different status after the 6th of April. I mean, that obviously does create challenges, particularly if they've been working outside IR35 on an assignment and then they get an inside IR35 assessment. Our advice has always been that you need to discuss how they should provide their services, whether it's payroll, umbrella, or inside IR35 deemed payroll. But whatever you choose, there should be a new contract, because one of the issues that has come up repeatedly and is getting quite a bit of noise is this idea of workers unfairly having deductions made from their pay. And this is effectively around the employer's NICs and the apprenticeship levy. Now, unless the client, as I think Andy mentioned, unless the client agrees to a pretty tasty rise in the fee rate, then that 13% and that apprenticeship levy is going to have to be found out of that rate that's already been agreed. That means it's absolutely critical that you offer the contractor new terms with that lower rate, or rather with a lower contractor rate, because you have to find the funds, and whether you're an umbrella company or whether you're an agency, you have to find the funds to pay Hmrc, the employer's NICs. So it's very clear, and Hmrc has sought to give out a very clear message here that both recruiters and umbrella companies have a legal obligation and a right to deduct employers' NICs. So this brings me on to, I think, what will continue to be a challenge, which is to think about the status of an assignment as early in the process as possible, which I think Andy's already mentioned. And what we saw in the public sector was assignments being advertised as outside or inside. But it's not just about the advertisement, it's also about the rates. It's really important to explain fully to a worker what their actual rate is, and to not be unclear around an umbrella rate. For example, a worker could be told their rate will be £440 a day if they go PAYE payroll, but will be £500 a day if they go umbrella. Now, the reality of that isn't the case, because although the recruitment company pays the umbrella company £500, the umbrella company, that's not the contractor's pay rate. The umbrella company has to take its employer's costs out of that, and only then do you have the contractor pay rate, which might well be the same as the PAYE rate. So it's just around being extremely clear. Recruiters really do have an obligation to be very clear to workers as to what the actual rate is. Now, there's the key information document that should be available to workers to help them understand this. Also, a lot of umbrellas have payroll calculators, and if you work with a PSL, then often they're very happy to share those calculators with you. But I think that's a really difficult point, that the industry as a whole needs to get its head around, that clarity around rates.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, and I think it's in the future, we're ultimately aiming for both recruiters and then clients in the chain, being as transparent as possible, making sure that everything's crystal clear, so that later on down the line, when somebody is paid, or if there's a dispute of any kind, there's no kind of hidden gems that suddenly come to the forefront. Andy, is there anything that you're seeing in terms of do's and don'ts, best practices that perhaps some recruiters are implementing and some aren't?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges that I'm hearing is just the all of the different supply chains are doing different things, and you sat as a recruitment company supplying into a number of clients, and those clients using different assessment tools or some blanket banning, and you sat there as the fee payer owning some of this risk. It does make things quite challenging, and some of those supply chains and status determinations you may feel really comfortable with. There may be certain supply chains that you think, well, how was this determination made? Who made it? And we weren't involved in any of that. I'm sat here with a certificate that says this contractor is outside IR35, but is this contractor really outside IR35? Is there anything that I can do there to get myself more comfortable? And if that client is just, we've done our status determinations and that's it, it does pose quite a few challenges. So I think that's going to take a little bit of getting used to. And I mean, just thinking some possible solutions here from what Kingsbridge are doing. There's the idea that the Kingsbridge status tool, for instance, could be used as a sense check to determine, okay, between you and the contractor, do you agree with this determination? Ideally, the client's involved, and our tool works well if they're very keen to do so. But if they're not keen to do a sense check because they already feel like they've made a determination, what can you do? And you look at other reviews potentially, or even insurance then to try and help. But I think, again, sort of semi-repeating what I said earlier, the big do for me is like there's still opportunity out there. Keep going. There are clients still that we're getting calls regularly still from clients saying, can you help? We've either said no to any limited companies, or we tried to use the CES tool and we've sort of muddled our way through, but really could do with some help sense checking what we've done. And whether that's Kingsbridge, whether that's the recruitment business going and helping them, whoever that is, that brings quite a lot of opportunity to that business. So get yourselves in, and if you've done nothing yet, there's still plenty of time. You can reach out to the likes of APSCo, use their resources, come to Kingsbridge, go to whoever who can help you. But get yourself in a place where you feel like you can add value to your client. And as I said, that will just bring more and more opportunity to you. We ultimately have partners today that have more limited companies post-April than they did before. And a lot of that has come from this idea that the client sitting as both as the engager and the fee payer assumes all of the risk. Whereas a recruitment business sitting in that supply chain, helping them with the determination, maybe offering that this could be insured, that actually might help the client firstly get comfortable that we could assess the contractors. That'll get rid of all of the headache of contractors just disputing that, or potentially leaving to looking at other jobs. And you sit in that supply chain, you pay the contractor. Obviously, that brings some commercial reward to you as well.
Tania, I personally find it remarkable how much work agencies have done for every supply chain. There is so much that agencies have taken on. They've essentially adapted a new skill in learning what is in most cases quite complex employment status tests. is this something that you think will continue? So, whilst a lot of agencies are very, very keen to do quite a lot now to help their end clients, to engage with contractors, ultimately it's in everybody's interest that that keeps on happening in that chain. But is that something that you see happening more and more as we go on? Is it something that you think APSCo members will continue to embrace? And what do you think the outlook is from APSCo's perspective in terms of both contractors and indeed those partners of yours? Where do you think they'll be in kind of 3 to 5 years' time?
Okay, quite a big question there. I think, ultimately, I agree with Andy that, the flexible labour market's not going anywhere, particularly the highly skilled flexible labour market. It's very much in line with the government's Build Back Britain idea of, we're going to be a highly skilled STEM economy. So yes, the future looks good. I think initially some members, particularly ones that perhaps were a bit small and hadn't quite taken as much notice, were flabbergasted, frankly, that they have the liability in the supply chain, because it is unfair and there's no real reason for it, apart from it's convenient. So they were flabbergasted that they had the liability in the supply chain for the unpaid tax if the client had taken reasonable care. I don't see our members sort of walking away from professional contracting business unless it was never their particular sector anyway. So I think our members will remain engaged and become even more engaged with their clients in, as Andy says, assisting them to make the right decision and as a means of differentiating themselves, I suppose, from competitors. And so therefore this may well, and I see this as well, this may well result in them introducing status tools such as the Kingsbridge tool and introducing insurance such as the Kingsbridge insurance to sort of give protection to everybody in the chain. There's a lot of talk of more offshoring in the way, in the sense of getting teams, whether in Asia or in Eastern European or Eastern Europe or, wherever, to do work that traditionally has been done in the UK by contractors. I don't think that's necessarily due to off-payroll, just due to off-payroll. It's also due, I think, a COVID effect, that it's become very clear that much more can be done remotely than was ever thought before. I don't know what the long-term outlook for that is in terms of whether it's really going to have a noticeable effect on the domestic market. And really, it's just not keeping an eye on what Hmrc enforcement activity will be. Now, in the first year, they've said, well, there's no penalties. We're very much looking to work with industry to bed this down. But, they have a number of years to bring claims, and they very often sort of don't actually do enforcement until towards the end of the period. And so I guess there is, there will continue to be a degree of concern as to actually what are Hmrc's intentions as to enforcement and how will those intentions change over the next 3 to 6 years.
Definitely, I would absolutely echo that. And I think if I could, Tania, just one more question before we go to kind of draw a conclusion to this session. One thing that's come up a couple of times over the last few months is, what we effectively now have is 2 sets of rules governing the same thing within the private sector, with the clients who are obviously medium or large size having to deal with status. But those small end clients, the rules are effectively back on the contractor as you were. Do you think that over time, perhaps, in the long run, Hmrc might say, well, actually, look, why have we got 2 sets of rules effectively doing the same thing for different parts of the supply chain? Do you think that small company exemption might eventually disappear? Without holding you
This
to a
really
crystal
is
ball.
just exactly. This really is clearly just my opinion, because
Yeah.
there's absolutely nothing out there on which to form a view particularly. I think the government want to be seen to support SMEs. And therefore, by allowing a small company exemption, they can argue that there's less administration on SMEs, and therefore they can get on with their business. So from that perspective, I don't see a pressure to change this exemption. I think they did it for that reason. If, however, they start to see it as an avoidance technique, through the use of consultancies, etc., then they may reconsider. But again, they have introduced a targeted anti-avoidance regulation into off-payroll to deal with this situation. So again, I don't think their first step would be to go, oh, well, we've got to withdraw the small company exemption because it's being abused. But on the other hand, I guess it's something that they could always consider in the future.
Perfect.
But hopefully, off-payroll will become obsolete before then, because they'll have changed the tax law to make it a lot fairer and simpler.
We can certainly keep our fingers crossed, but I think short term, it doesn't look like it's moving anywhere just yet. But yeah, long term, we can hope that there is a much, I guess, clearer reform for everybody, because, as you say, these rules are far too complex for the number of businesses that are having to adapt to obviously new changes. Andy Robinson, final question. I'll post to you. As I say there before we draw to a conclusion, do you think more recruiters are now becoming comfortable with using status tools, becoming comfortable with effectively what status is, and do you think that over the coming months and years to come, we'll see that increase and we'll see more businesses become more comfortable with status naturally?
I think it was quite a steep learning curve for most, and I mean, I've been heavily involved in IR35 for a while now, and I'm in no way an expert in IR35. It is a very, very complicated area, and whilst I have many conversations with recruitment businesses where that recruiter knows a lot about IR35 and can communicate IR35, the challenge is you don't want to be too involved in the actual determination and advising people on is this contractor inside or outside, and my advice there is to go to a business that can help you. It is such a grey, subjective in certain times, like law, and you need to make sure that you as a business are really comfortable with advice is the wrong word, but like a party that you are introducing to help make those determinations. But yeah, I think that there's still it's still really early days. We're in April and the legislation came in on April the 6th. So it's like there was a lot of good work to get us through that period, but there is certainly a lot more still to do.
Excellent. And I think on that note, Andy, I'll give you an opportunity for your final message. Any kind of final tips from you?
Well, the tip from me is there are resources out there. If you are struggling with R35, if you're one of those businesses that are still thinking, well, we didn't do anything and we didn't help our clients, there is still definitely time, but the starting point is to reach out to a business that can help you. A business like association like APSCo, with all of the resources that they have, businesses like Kingsbridge, again, we're here to help wherever we can. The starting point is just to really understand what this legislation is, what your clients are doing, where you think maybe you could help, and that might be you don't think you can and you don't want to, and that is fine, but there is an opportunity out there for those that can really get their heads around it and seek those opportunities.
Perfect. And Tania, from you as well, is there a final message that you'd like to kind of echo or emphasize on?
I think, firstly, well done so far for getting over the 6th of April hump to everybody out there. But just keep your eye on the ball, I think. Every single new assignment will need to be assessed. or rather, any assignment where the client's been very clear there's the potential for an outside IR35 contractor. Once they're running, you need to keep an eye out, you need to keep in touch with the client and the contractor so that you kind of pick up if the status has changed, or if the contract is doing something different to what they were initially sent in for. And for those that aren't working through the outside route, then just making sure your supply chain is in order, that you understand and know your umbrella companies, their APSCo trusted partners, FCSA or professional passport, so that, for both inside IR35 and outside IR35, you have nice, clear processes and procedures in place to manage your risk, and your employees are trained and you keep them in the loop to make sure they're also giving out the right messages to your contractors and your clients.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to the both of you, Andy Robinson of Kingsbridge, Tania Bowers of APSCo, and thank you to the wider organisation of APSCo as well. There's plenty of businesses doing quite a lot for the chain. APSCo are certainly one of those doing far more than some others. So yeah, absolutely continue to keep up that work, and Kingsbridge will absolutely be doing just as much if we can. So.
It's been a busy year.
Yeah, it certainly has. I'll certainly relieve that there was no final kind of last-minute delay again, that's for sure. But thank you very much for everybody who's actually attended the call today. Just a quick reminder that this call will be sent out via email as well after the session. So if you've joined late, or if you've simply had to dip off early, you know why I've said that, because you wouldn't be here if you have. But either way, you'll be sent a recording afterwards via email, so you can obviously go through and catch up on anything that you may have missed or misheard, or just simply want to hear again. Any questions that you've submitted, we will try and get back to those via email. Very, very important. If there are any last minute ones that you want to get in, please do, and we'll get back to as many of those as we can via email after this call as well. But thank you very much for joining us, and we hopefully will look forward to seeing you again on another session in the near future.